The next topic to cover while we talk about the Industrial Revolution and industrialism in the United States is trusts and monopolies. We already mentioned that freed slaves and immigrants were an influx into the economy, giving business owners extremely cheap labor, which is part of the land, labor, capital phrase that we learned that helps the United States economy grow during the industrial period. Trusts and monopolies make it even harder for workers because if a particular boss, let's say John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, can gain control of an entire market, not only are workers already probably getting low wages due to the large number of workers and the competitiveness of wages, but now that the monopoly is in control of an entire industry, their wages are probably going to go even lower because they cannot quit their job and go to a competitor for employment. They're stuck with a company like Standard Oil. So to start off with, what is a trust? What is a monopoly? When many small businesses merge into one large corporation, that is a trust. So an example would be ExxonMobil, the gas company. They were once Exxon and Mobil, but they merged together to form an extremely large trust called ExxonMobil. Now, when one corporation manages to gain control of almost an entire industry, that is known as a monopoly, which is made famous by the board game. Examples of that, the first example is railroad pooling. Railroads that had once been competitors got together and agreed to all charge the same high prices. To make matters worse, railroads also began charging more for a short haul than a long haul. The best comparison I can make to this is that if you shop at a wholesale club, like BJ's Wholesale for example, it is cheaper to buy things in bulk. So by that logic, one would think a long haul would be cheaper per mile than a short haul. And that's not the case, and really the only reasoning for that is the railroad companies wanting to maximize their profits at the expense of the consumer. This was made possible when railroads would divide up territories and agree on who would control what region. So for example, the New York Central Railroad controlled the metropolitan area of New York City and much of the remainder of New York State. Further examples, John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, which has already been mentioned. Rockefeller enters the oil business when it's a highly competitive market. It's not easy to make money in oil. But within only 10 years after starting the Standard Oil Company, Rockefeller's 200-plus rivals had dwindled down to just a few. How does he achieve this? There's a few things. First, he convinces railroads to give his company rebates. And if they give him rebates, he can ship his oil cheaper than his competitors. Over time, his competitors will begin struggling because people are buying his cheaper oil rather than theirs. So he buys out his struggling rivals. Lastly, after buying out most of his rivals, he builds oil pipelines to cut out the railroads who had originally allowed him the cheaper prices on his oil by shipping them cheaply. So he cuts out the very people who helped him get established. He builds oil pipelines owned by Standard Oil and pays no freight charges as a result. Rockefeller was an extremely ruthless businessman, but did gain a monopoly control over the oil industry. Andrew Carnegie and Carnegie Steel. Carnegie actually started out working in a cotton mill in Scotland, earning only like 20 cents a day. He comes to the United States, and through very careful investment of his money, he's able to start his own steel company. Using many of the same tactics as Rockefeller, he pays his workers extremely low wages, tries to put all of his competitors out of business, and eventually he sells his company after 30 years for almost $500 million. That is an obscene amount of money today, let alone when Andrew Carnegie received it for his company. Compare that today, and that would be like Bill Gates selling Microsoft. That is how massive of a company Carnegie Steel was. So what does the government try to do to stop the monopolies? In 1890, they pass the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is an attempt to control monopolies. However, any company with a good lawyer could sift through the vague language of the law and find a way around it. So it's extremely ineffective. And in this cartoon, extremely famous, you must know it. It will likely be on your test from me, and it is very often seen on the Regents exam itself. It depicts large trusts sitting in the rear of the Senate chambers. These huge men are representing the trusts, and they're very intimidating to the much smaller men representing the senators. So it's really just showing that often government officials were doing the bidding of large trusts. Sometimes these men did so out of fear. Other times they were probably being paid off or had their election campaigns contributed to by some of the corrupt businessmen. Lastly, the United States versus E.C. Knight in 1895. This is a case where a sugar monopoly is controlling over 95% of the sugar industry. The federal government tries to take action against that sugar trust, but the Supreme Court ruled that the trust could not be broken up. Why is that? First, let's review a case we learned earlier in the year. The case of Gibbs versus Ogden in 1823 was when Ogden had an exclusive trading relationship on the Hudson River. And Gibbs also wanted to trade on the Hudson River but could not because of the agreement reached with Ogden by the state of New York. However, the Supreme Court said, Ogden, you are not entitled to that agreement. We are now busting up that agreement, and Gibbs can now also trade on the Hudson River because the Hudson River services both the state of New York and the state of New Jersey. That makes it interstate commerce, which can be regulated by the federal government. So the first time you have seen this term and learned this term was when we learned Gibbs versus Ogden early in the year. This was a Marshall Court decision. But in this case of U.S. versus E.C. Knight, it is the exact opposite, because the trust is contained within one state's lines, and that is the state of Florida. The federal government is powerless because it is not interstate commerce, rather it is intrastate commerce. To review those terms again, like we did earlier in the year, when you go to college, you often play intramural sports. Well, that's because those intramural sports are played within that school. If you were playing other schools in a casual sport, it would be intramurals. So intramural sports is because you're playing within your college. Intra would be playing others. So trade, interstate, is between multiple states. Intrastate commerce is within one state. And that is what is the big difference between Gibbs versus Ogden and U.S. versus E.C. Knight. These are two court cases that in an essay, for example, you could compare and contrast. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you take the online quiz. Use your notes that you've taken. If you use your notes, there's no reason you should not receive a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.